class on Monday. All right, so let's get started on chapter 9. So the second of the 4 market structures we're going to cover. Perfect competition was sort of on one end of the spectrum of market structures, and monopoly really sits on that other opposite end, okay? So it's as different a market structure as we could possibly be discussing from perfect competition. So a monopoly market structure, I think for a lot of us, you know, it already brings up, right, a connotation. We already know a little bit about a monopoly market structure. We know that there's usually one supplier in that market, and that's the definition, right? That's the one thing we know for sure, is that there's one supplier in that market. And that already helps us with those 4 sort of attributes that we talk about in monopoly market structure. Is the number of suppliers in the market was really the first one, and we know there's one, right? Another one is the degree of uniformity. Well, between suppliers, well, there's only one supplier, so we don't even need to discuss that, right? And then another one was the forms of competition among suppliers. Well, there's only one supplier, so we don't need to talk about that either. The important one that we need to talk about, the real game changer, is that ease of entry and exit in and out of the market. Like, how do we see suppliers flow in and out of this type of market structure? Well, that's easy. They don't flow in and out of this type of market structure, okay? And so this is really the one we're going to focus on. This entire PowerPoint is on that attribute, ease of entry and exit, okay? And what we can say is it's not easy to get in, and there's not a whole lot of reason to get out. So monopolies usually exist for very specific reasons. There's a reason there's only one supplier in that market. And the biggest reasons for the monopolies we're going to discuss are actually this first one and this last one. The one in between is sort of an anomaly that we touched on before. But let's talk about 1 and 3, and then we'll double back to the one in the middle, that second reason. So one of the most common ones, one of the most common reasons why we have a barrier to entry into that market that keeps that one supplier isolated is there's a legal restriction. So there's some sort of licensing, there's some sort of patent that has created a situation where this one supplier is isolated in this market, and really no other suppliers are allowed in because they simply do not have the ability legally to begin to produce that good or service, okay? And obviously, this is going to be one of the most common, is the patents and licensing. The number of patents in this country is really phenomenal. And those patents last for decades, right? Which keeps this sort of insulation of this firm active really for decades. The last one is another common reason, not quite as common as the patents, but or the legal restrictions, is the control of an essential resource. If you are producing a good and you go buy up all of the resource that is necessary to produce that good, whether it's labor, like expertise, whether it's a physical natural resource, something like that, then obviously you're the only one that can make it. The US government does try and keep monopolies from forming through mergers and things like that. If 2 companies are going to merge in present day, they actually have to get permission by the federal government in order to merge. Now, it's a little tricky to keep a firm who has a brand new product that they've put a patent and some licensing and registered and all of that. It's hard to keep a firm like that who starts to produce a new product and starts a new market. It's hard to keep them from being a monopoly, right? So sometimes you can't really help it. And it usually isn't that big of a deal, especially if the good is sort of maybe a luxury good, something that is non-essential, a non-necessity. Now, here's where the problem lies. is there are times when, and we've seen this, one of the best examples recently has been drug companies. Drug companies invent a new drug. It is a life-saving drug, and they want to charge exorbitant prices for it. Well, you and I, as citizens of a country that embraces free speech, you and I protest against things like that, not physically, sometimes physically, but we also start to contact politicians and start to sort of create awareness that this is wrong, that the way that this monopoly is operating is wrong. And in a lot of cases, they don't actually get the highest price they could for their medication because there's too much backlash, okay? Some of them still charge too much. It's exorbitant, right? But it also takes a lot of money in research and development to develop them. So it's a balance for sure. This middle one here, economies of scale, we're really talking about natural monopolies here. Natural monopolies, I touched on natural monopolies. Probably back in chapter 3, I think, I touched on the government's role, and it was to regulate natural monopolies. And so I sort of gave you a little explanation on that. Natural monopolies, best example is like utilities in your particular city. A lot of times there's only one electric company, and one gas company, and one water company. Well, that's because there just simply is not enough consumer, there's not enough business to allow two companies to exist in those markets. So the government swoops in, they regulate them because those things are necessities, okay? We're really not going to talk about natural monopolies in this particular chapter. We're going to focus on the other monopolies, the monopolies that do have a lot of control over their pricing and things like that, okay? All right, let's talk about the revenue of a monopolist. This is the difference between chapter 8 and chapter 9, between perfect competition and monopoly. The biggest difference in how we analyze these firms, find profit maximization, it has to do with the revenue that a monopolist has the opportunity to generate versus a perfectly competitive firm, okay? Monopolists are price makers, not price takers. A monopolist actually gets to choose their price, okay? If you think about what we did in the last chapter, we found the market supply and demand and the equilibrium price, and the perfectly competitive firm had to accept that price. They were a price taker. Well, if you think about a monopolist and the supply curve and demand curve in a market that a monopolist monopolizes, what you'll quickly, I think, recognize is that that supply curve belongs to that single supplier. There's only one supplier in the market. So when you look at market supply, well, that's the supply of one firm in the market. And then when you think about the demand curve, right, that downward sloping demand curve in the market, there is one supplier to meet all of that demand. So if you're a monopolist, you can look at the market supply and demand and take it. It's yours. That supply curve's yours, belongs to you, right? All the data actually came from you as the only supplier in the market, and the demand belongs to only you. So we don't have, like we did under perfect competition, we don't have a market demand curve and then a firm demand curve, that horizontal line. It's the same. Market and firm is the same because the firm is the market, okay? So the demand for a monopolist good is also the market demand. They get all of it, okay? A monopolist price is equal to average revenue. Well, this is, we're only telling you this because if you remember, in the last chapter, right, we had this perfectly horizontal firm demand curve that was equal to average revenue, that was equal to marginal revenue. Well, that doesn't look the same as it used to. under a monopolist market structure. So we're going to take these three pieces, demand, average revenue, marginal revenue, and we're going to explain to you how they look different. Okay? What this is saying is that price or the demand curve is equal to average revenue. So what we're saying is we're still going to find this to be true, right? But remember, our demand curve no longer looks like this. It's downward sloping instead because we get the market demand. Sorry, I know that isn't showing up, but. So the demand curve is also the average revenue curve. So D equals AR, okay, downward sloping. And marginal revenue is no longer the same curve, is no longer the same line. It's new, it's different. Because marginal revenue is always less than the price under under monopolistic conditions after the first unit sold. And we're gonna walk through that here in a minute, so just hang on to that. This is what's different, these curves. These curves are what's different under a monopolist market structure versus a perfectly competitive market structure. We still have these curves, they just look different. All of your cost curves remain the same. A monopolist, right, doesn't necessarily have different costs than everybody else. What they have is different revenue than everybody. That's really the difference. Yeah, costs might change a little bit, okay? You might not have to spend as much on advertising or something like that because you don't have to advertise, or not competitively anyway. But what's different is the revenue. What's different is the revenue. So any questions on this? I'm gonna show you a graph here in a minute. Kind of on a side note, you know, here in the US, forming a monopoly, merging two companies into a monopoly, it's hardly even possible because the US government regulates monopolies so closely. But this country used to be really, our entire economy used to really be monopolized by, I think it's 5 or 6 families. And if you're interested in stuff like that, if you geek out on stuff like that, economic history and that kind of stuff, there's a great Netflix documentary series. I think it's called The Men Who Built America. And I think it's a handful of episodes that go through like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and Ford and some of the big families that at one point, I think owned 80 to 90% of the US economy. It was really because of that people began to sort of rebel against this idea of the monopolist, and we got some of our first regulations and laws in this country against monopolies, antitrust laws and things like that. So if you're interested in something like that, we all have a little extra time on our hands, so it's a great look at US economic history. So let's look at a graph here real quick, and I think it'll hopefully help us think about this marginal revenue piece of this discussion, okay? This is a pretty important graph, and I would say this is like a classic Baca graph for chapter 3, exam 3. Is this graph and then having you go through the analysis that we're about to do. So I take some notes here to make sure you know how to use this graph and why it's meaningful. So what you see here is a downward sloping demand curve. That's your red line there. This is for a monopolist. So a monopolist gets that market downward sloping demand curve. And then we're going to do an analysis for this monopolist. This is, the example here is the De Beers Diamond Company, which actually used to be pretty much a monopoly. Not so much today. They probably own 70 to 80% of the diamond market, but they used to own more because they had control over that essential resource. They owned most diamond mines in the world. Since then, other companies have bought diamond mines and begun to mine them for themselves. But you can see what you're looking at here is the De Beers Diamond Company trying to decide what would happen if they went from selling 3 1-carat diamonds per day to 4 1-carat diamonds per day. Obviously, these numbers should be a lot bigger, right? But we're just keeping it simple. So the demand curve says that if we want to sell 3 diamonds a day, we should price them at $7,000 a piece. Now, that demand curve data came from you and me. It came from those who were demanding in the market. So that information is basically given to the monopolist. It is like, here is all the demand information. Now you get to choose where you're gonna sell along that demand curve, right? How you're gonna meet demand, where you're gonna meet demand. At $7,000 a piece, we would sell 3 diamonds per day. If we want to sell 4 diamonds per day, we have to mark down the price of the diamonds. Not just the 4th diamond, because we don't know who is going to buy the 4th diamond that's willing to pay the $67.50. We actually have to mark down the price of all 4 diamonds to $67.50. If you want to sell more, right, you have to mark down the price. We know that about demand. You and I will buy more at a lower price, okay? And so what happens here is we end up, as we're moving from 3 diamonds to 4 diamonds, and therefore the price is moving from $7,000 to $67.50, we experience both a loss and gain in revenue at different ends of this that then net together to either give us a positive or a negative, what I would call like a net revenue in this case. So let's talk about the loss piece of this. If you were only going to sell 3 diamonds, you could have gotten $7,000 a piece for them. But if you want to sell 4 diamonds, you have to mark all of your diamonds down to $67.50. This loss represents the difference, the $250 that you could have made on those first 3 diamonds, but because you want to sell diamond number 4, you're going to lose that $250 per diamond. So your loss in this case is the 250 times 3. 250 times 3. So if we were going to calculate the value of that pink area, right? 250 times 3 gives me a loss, right? I'm losing the 250 of a negative 750, negative $750. I'm sorry, you guys can't hardly see this. And then your gain, or the blue part that you see, is the additional revenue you actually get from unit number 4. So you lost $250 on units 1 through 3, but you're gaining the sales price for unit number 4. So how much revenue did we get for unit number 4? Well, we got $67.50 because that was the price. Okay, so positive $67.50. And when we net those two together, we end up with a positive 6,000. So we have a negative 750, a positive 6750, which gives us 6,000. What would you call that 6,000 in economic speak, terminology that I've already given you? What would you call this $6,000? It's your marginal revenue. Not total revenue, Devin, this is your marginal revenue. This is how much additional revenue you got from just selling unit number 4. There's another way to find this. Looking at this, back graph. So looking at the graph on the slide, there's another way to actually find these numbers. And that is to come up with total revenues. So what was your total revenue when you sold 3 units? Well, 3 times 7,000 is 21,000, right? So you were making 21,000 in total revenue. And then when you sold 4 units, 4 times 6750 is actually going to give you 27,000 in total revenue. So you had total revenue of 21 when you sold 3 units, and when you sold 4 units, you had total revenue of 27,000. The difference, not coincidentally, is the same $6,000, right? Your marginal revenue, what's the additional revenue you got from selling that 4th unit? Any questions on this? You should know how to look at this graph, tell me what the loss is, tell me what the gain is, be able to net them together and express that that is marginal revenue. Okay? Any questions? All right. So here is a chart with revenue. This is all stuff you've seen before. Don't overthink this, right? So here we have quantity of diamonds, 0 through 17. We stop at 17 for kind of an obvious reason, but I'll show you that here in a minute. Your price in dollars. So this is the information off the demand curve, right? We've already done this, right? We did this back here. We found information off the demand curve at 3 units, at 4 units. This is just all the different points on the demand curve, or all the different quantities that would have been graphed. But you can see here at 3, it says 7,000, and at 4, it says 6,750. That's all this is. Your total revenue, quantity times price gives you total revenue. And then your marginal revenue is the difference. How much is total revenue going up when we sell 1 additional unit of this good? And here's the 6,000 we just calculated, right? As we went from 21,000 to 27, or 3 diamonds to 4 diamonds, you can see that our marginal revenue was 6,000. What I said to you about marginal revenue, first time I mentioned it, a couple slides ago, is that it's always less than the price after the first unit sold. So you can see here, here's the price, okay? Here's the marginal revenue. Our first unit sold, it's $7,500 for both. But after the first unit sold, marginal revenue is always less than the price. Why? Because we have to mark down units in order to sell additional units. That's the way a demand curve works. You want to sell more, you got to reduce the price, which means you've marked down those first units you could have sold at a higher price in order to sell that additional unit at a lower price. Everybody good? You can see that once you get to 17 units, your marginal revenue becomes negative. It doesn't make any sense to be making units after 16, okay? All right. What you are looking at here is how the revenue curves now look compared to perfectly competitive firms. That top graph shows your red demand curve, downward sloping demand curve. You now have a marginal revenue line. That's going to be the green one right there. Those used to all be stacked together in that perfectly horizontal line. We had demand, we had average revenue, and we had marginal revenue, and they were all stacked together on that horizontal line. This is what that looks like now. Now we have a downward sloping demand curve, which is also our average revenue, but our marginal revenue found itself a new curve, a new line, okay? The way we analyze this information, the way we calculate this data, it's all the same. It just looks a little different, right? When we graph it. Cost curves are going to stay the same. It's the revenue demand that's different. And you know it's different. How can it not be different if you're the only supplier in the market versus a supplier in the market who gets handed a price and just gets to determine a quantity, right? Makes sense. So, demand, marginal revenue, and then our total revenue is this bell shape. Do you remember that our total revenue under perfect competition was an upward sloping, perfectly sloped, right, line? Our total revenue was actually a line that started at the origin and had this perfect slope, right? As we sold an additional unit for $5 or $3 or whatever it was, okay? But then it goes back down. Our goal is usually to get somewhere in here. This is usually where we end up profit maximizing. Now, until you put cost information on here, I actually can't tell you where you profit maximize, okay? We need both pieces. We need revenue and costs to figure out profit. And so we have to bring our cost curves in before we can do anything else. Any questions about this before I bring up the second PowerPoint? All right. All right, so let's talk about profit maximization, because what else is there, right? A lot of the stuff I'm going to say about profit maximization under monopoly market structure is going to be very similar to stuff you've already heard. And in many cases, it's going to be word for word, okay? So let's keep in mind that monopolies are price makers, not price takers. They're price makers. They get to decide what price they're going to sell. They're good at what price along that demand curve they want to sell at. Here's the thing, they still have some constraints. You can't pick a price and a quantity. They come as a set. They come as a point on the demand curve. You can choose a price and take the quantity that goes with it, or choose a quantity and accept the price that goes with it. But you can't just choose some random price and quantity, right? That doesn't work. It has to be something along the demand curve, or it just doesn't make sense, okay? As compared to perfect competition, where the price was determined for them and they just got to pick the quantity. They just had to accept the quantity at which they profit maximized, okay? This isn't that much different of a scenario, because a monopolist is still gonna wanna find their profit maximizing quantity, right? They're still gonna focus on quantity, but theoretically they can choose price or quantity. So we call them a price maker. You've seen all of this before. Everything on here you've seen before, okay? We want to figure out where total revenue minus total cost, which would give us total profit. We want to find where the difference or the distance is the greatest between those two. We want to find where total revenue exceeds total cost by the greatest amount, so that when we do the subtraction, total revenue minus total cost, we get the highest number possible, okay? Now we know how to do that on a graph, and that's the way we're gonna do it, but you know, you could do it mathematically too. This bottom piece here, I think I actually copied and pasted it from the previous chapter. The golden rule of profit maximization, which is that you find your profit maximizing output where MR equals MC. That remains the same. That's actually never going to change no matter what market structure you're in, okay? So the golden rule still holds true. The place where it gets complicated, right, is when we try and do that analysis on the graphs, because our graphs look a little different now, because those revenue demand curve lines look different. So let's take a look at this. You've seen something similar, right? In the last chapter, it probably was even exact, but the numbers here look a little different, okay? Because of the type of market structure that we're in. So you can see here in column 1, right? We have diamonds per day. We know we don't want to go past 17. We already discussed why, right? It's because the marginal revenue or additional revenue we get from selling that unit is negative. We don't want that. Here's our price. The price is just the price that coincides with the quantity on the demand curve. So it's just information that the monopolist found on our demand curve. right? The consumer's demand curve, and wrote down. So this is just the corresponding data. Total revenue, just quantity times price. So 2 times 72.50 gives us 14.5. Marginal revenue is the difference, right? Okay, you've already seen columns 1 through 4 a few slides ago, right? Well, now we've added the cost data on here because you can't figure out profit until you have revenue and cost, so you can do that subtraction. Your total cost has been given to you. You didn't have to calculate it. We just said, here's your total cost. Your accountants handed it to you. What is fixed cost in this case? What is fixed costs for this monopolist? Thanks, Dennis. It's 15,000. How do we know? Well, we know when we produce nothing, whatever our total cost is, that's actually our fixed. We have no variable because we haven't made anything. And variable fluctuates, right, with production. It goes up. It's things like raw materials and labor and things like that, that as we produce more, right, that would go up. So we know it's 15,000. Our marginal cost is just the difference in total cost as we go from one unit to the next. So the difference between 15,000 and 19,750 is going to be is 47.50, so on and so forth. Marginal cost starts high, dips down, rises back, and goes even higher. It's the check mark, right? The check mark. Your ATC, that's your U-shaped curve, right? If this kept going, you would see it complete its U. But ATC, average total cost, is just what's your total cost divided by whatever the quantity is. It's just, you're trying to find an average. It's just a simple average, okay? That's what you have here. And then total profit and loss is total revenue, which is here in column 3, minus total cost, which is here in column 5. You can see it follows the pattern we would expect it to follow. Starts negative. Usually we have losses in the beginning because we have this huge amount of fixed cost. And as we make 1 unit or 2 units or 3 units, all of that fixed cost, right, gets assigned to just those few units. The more we make, the more we can spread those fixed costs out, and we can begin to turn a profit. You can see here we have positive profits, and then we go back to losses again. Even a monopolist is going to experience this, right? Because we see those increasing marginal returns and then the law of decreasing marginal returns kick in. Even a monopolist has fixed resources. It's that pizza restaurant example I went through. Even a monopolist is going to have constraints. So you can see, it's kind of hard to see on this actually, but this quantity of 10, this entire line of information, this has all been bolded because this is our profit maximizing quantity and all of the information associated with that profit maximizing quantity. You can see here, 12,500, that is the maximum profit that we see here. If we look at the marginal revenue, we can see it's 3,000. Our marginal cost is 27.50. That's good. Our marginal revenue is greater than our marginal cost. So what we're selling that unit for is greater than what it's costing us to make that unit. You can see that when we hit 11, we're only getting 2,500 for that unit, and it's costing us 32.50 to make. We'd never want to sell unit number 11, right? So this is where we would, 10 is where we would find MR equals MC, or the closest thing to MR equals MC on your graph. That was it? Okay. When you find MR equals MC on a graph, and it's between like units 10 and 11, you want to round down to unit 10, okay? All right, so let's look at the graphs. So this first, for some reason, your author flipped the per unit and the totals on this particular slide. I'm not exactly sure why, but hopefully that doesn't confuse you. If you'll remember in the last chapter, we looked at the totals first, and then we looked at the per units. Here we're doing it the opposite. But this per unit one is by far the most important. You'll see that the cost curves look the same as the one we have been talking about for chapters now. You have your check mark, your MC, this pink one here. You have this brown, dark brown one here, your ATC. Those look exactly the same. But when you were looking at perfectly competitive markets, you were looking at those curves plus this perfectly horizontal demand curve, which also was equal to marginal revenue. Well, now those look different. But your analysis of this graph is exactly the same as the analysis you did with your other graphs, your other curves. It's kind of a three-step process. Analyzing these per unit graphs are a three-step process. The first thing I always do is look for MR equals MC. It's the first thing you got to do. Why do you care about any quantity except for MR equals MC? You don't. You don't care. So I want to know what quantity I'm focused on. And in this case, I find MR equals MC here at point E. I go down to the x-axis, I find my quantity of 10. Now, the only pieces of information I care about are the pieces of information associated with the quantity of 10. Step one. Step two, I want to find my price. What's the price I get to charge at that profit maximizing quantity? So my step two is find your demand curve. Find your demand curve, and your demand curve is going to have your price on it. It's where you go to find price. It's the only place to find price is your demand curve. So I've headed up to point A to find my price. And my price is $52.50. Step three, I want to find my ATC. Sometimes I got to go up, sometimes I got to go down. In this case, I get to go down to find my ATC. Remember, I'm laser focused on that dashed black line at a quantity of 10. So I head straight down, straight vertical along that dashed line, and I find point B on my ATC. Because I got to go down from my price to my ATC, I know I'm making a profit. Because my cost is lower than my price, that's a good thing. So I find an ATC, an average total cost of $4,000. The difference is my profit. My profit per unit is $12.50 per unit. The difference between the price and my average total cost is going to be $12.50. $12.50 per unit is my profit. How many units am I making? 10. $12.50 times 10 gives me $12,500. That number should sound familiar to you, right? It's the number we already found as being our total profit, okay? Any questions? It's the same process you used in the last chapter. It's just that those revenue curves look different. Your demand curve looks different, but it's still the same process. MR equals MC. Go find your price, go find your ATC. Do it all on that perfectly vertical plane at your profit maximizing quantity. You actually, like, I could erase all the pieces of those curves that lie to either side of that because they're totally irrelevant once you find MR equals MC and that quantity, because you don't care about any other quantities, okay? So I could just leave those little teeny, right, points on those curves and erase the rest of it because you don't even care once you find MR equals MC. The only reason MR and MC are on this graph is so you can find point E and trace down to quantity. Once you find your quantity, you don't need MR or MC again. You're done with those. It's the only reason you needed them. Now you need to go find your price on your demand curve and your cost on your ATC, okay? All right, down here, these are just your totals. So your total cost, starts at 15,000. Well, you know that because that's the fixed cost, right? The total cost line looks just the same as the one you saw in the last chapter. Just like your cost curves up here look the same. Those don't change. Okay, it's your revenue that changes. So then you can see a total revenue line, right? This bell-shaped curve right here, that is your total revenue. Total revenue for a monopolist rises to a peak and then begins to go back down again. We actually are going to find total profit, maximum total profit, the same way that we did in the last chapter. We're going to try and find the greatest vertical distance between total cost and total revenue when total cost dips below revenue. That's going to give us our maximum profit. And you can see in this case, it happens at a quantity of 10. You already know it should happen at a quantity of 10, right? And the total cost here is 40,000. The total revenue is 52.5. You subtract the two. Total revenue minus total cost, you get total profit, which is going to be 12,500. The same number we found up here and the same number that you saw back here, 12,500. Any questions on any of that? For those of you who understood, who got a good grasp of chapter 8, this shouldn't feel that crazy to you. It should just feel like your curves kind of changed angles, okay? But the way you analyze the data is actually exactly the same. The way you find profit maximization is actually exactly the same. This is actually a great place to stop.